Today we're talking about multiplying and dividing integers. So with multiplying and dividing integers, we have the exact same rule for both. With same signs, you're going to perform whatever operation, either multiplication or division, and then your sign will be positive. So anytime you multiply with the same sign or divide with the same sign, then your answer is always going to be positive. So this is a little different than adding integers. So what's 6 times 4? 24, correct. And since they're both the same sign, the answer is positive. What's 9 divided by 3? 3, correct. And so what's your sign? Positive, since they're both negative. Very good. When you have different signs, you're going to go ahead and perform your operation, either multiply or divide, and then your sign will be negative, always, if the two signs are different. So what's 6 times 3? 18, very good. And since they're different signs, what's the sign? Negative. Very good. 10 divided by 2 is what? 5. And so since they're different signs, it's a negative 5. So let's go through and make sure we understand where these rules come from. I have some pictures drawn here to help you understand. So with multiplication, we know that when we say, for example, 2 times 5, that actually means 2 groups of 5. This is how you were introduced to multiplication when you were younger, and you used what was called number sentences. So let's think about 4 number sentences we could use to describe this picture, which is a picture representing the idea of 3 groups of -2. So we have 1, 2, 3 groups, and inside of each groups we have 2 negative chips. So let's start with the multiplication table, with the multiplication sentence. So 3 groups of, if you get rid of that word groups, you're left with the word of. And what does of always tell you to do? What operation? It always tells you to multiply. So when we say that of means to multiply, a lot of times it's really because it's short for groups of, which is what multiplication is based on. So 3 of -2 is the same thing as 3 groups of -2, which is the same thing as 3 times -2. And obviously, if you look at the picture, it makes sense that 3 times -2 is -6, because when we have 3 groups with -2 in each, altogether that's 6 negatives. Now, since that makes sense to us, we're going to go ahead and write 3 other number sentences that come out of this number sentence. Sometimes it's hard to draw pictures and make sense out of what negatives mean. So if we can start with one that does make sense, like 3 groups of -2, then we can think through the properties. So in this case, we could also write -2 times +3 equals -6. So those mean the same thing, but it's another number sentence that fits in with 3 times -2 equals -6. So now let's switch to division. So let's start with -6 divided by, obviously we can choose 3 or -2. We're going to keep the signs the same on each number. So 3 is always positive, 2 is always negative, 6 is always negative. So let's say we start with -6 divided by 3. Since that 3 is positive, we're going to leave it positive, and that means we have to end up with a -2. So let's see if that makes sense. So we have 6 negatives divided into 3 groups. So here we have 6 negatives divided into 3 groups, which means that each group should have 2 negatives within it, which does work out. The other number sentence that comes out of the problem, 3 times -2 equaling -6, will be our other division problem. So what do you think it'll be? If you said -6 divided by -2 equals +3, then you are correct. So here we have -6 altogether, and we have 2 negatives in each group, and we want to see how many groups that gives us. That gives us 3 groups. So again, working with negatives, things don't always work out so pretty to look at, but this helps us to think through our rules. I want you to notice that if you have different signs, your answer is a negative. Different signs, answers a negative. Different signs, answers a negative. If you have same signs, as in this last example, -6 divided by -2, the answer is positive. So this is the reason why our rules are the way they are. When you have same signs, you end up with a positive. When you have different signs, you end up with a negative. Another way to remember these rules with multiplying and dividing negatives and positives is notice that whenever you have something times something equals something, two of the numbers are negative and one is positive. So you might notice here in the first problem, 3 times negative 2 equaling negative 6, you have two negatives and one positive. Two negatives in the next one, one positive, two negatives, one positive, two negatives, one positive. So if your problem has two negatives in it, then the answer has to be positive. If your problem has only one negative in it, then the answer has to be negative. So that's another way to think it through. Of course, this only works if you have two numbers being multiplied or two numbers being divided. When you start working with more than two, then it doesn't always work out that way. So now let's do a little bit of practicing. I'd like you to apply the properties, pause the video, and complete these 5 problems. So negative 6 times 5, you should have ended up with negative 30. Negative 100 times negative 20, you should have ended up with 5. 4 divided by 2, of course, is 2. Negative 7 times negative 8 is 56. 10 times negative 3 is negative 30. So once again, we notice that if we have different signs, we get a negative. If we have same signs, we get a positive. And that works for both multiplication and division. Now, another thing I want to mention is how to multiply when you have multiple signs or when you have more than one number. So for example, negative 3 times negative 2 times negative 5. Well, if we work from left to right, we're going to end up with positive 6 times negative 5, and then that gives us negative 30. But sometimes with our problems, it's a lot easier to think about what the sign is and then do the math than to worry about keeping up with the sign the whole time. So there's a trick, and the trick is if you have, well, first of all, do you know the trick? You may already know this. If you have an even number of negatives, the answer will be what? Does anybody know? It's going to be positive. So in this case, we don't have an even number. We have 1, 2, 3 numbers that are negative. So we have 3 negatives being multiplied together. So if I have an odd number of negatives, the answer will be negative. And I have that written out for you. With multiplication or division, an even number of negatives gives a positive answer. So even gives you positive. An odd number of negatives gives you a negative answer. And one thing to keep in mind with multiplication and division when you have multiple numbers is that with multiplication you can multiply in any order you want, whatever makes it easier. So actually in this problem up here, it doesn't matter that much because it's not that hard of a problem, but I would multiply 2 and 5 first because that gives me a nice easy 10 to work with. So negative 3 times 10 is negative 30. With division, however, you have to work from left to right if you have any division. Same thing with subtraction. So if I have negative 10 divided by negative 5 divided by 5, I have to work from left to right or my answer will be incorrect. Negative 10 divided by negative 5 is what? Positive 2. Good. Divided by 5, it's not such a great problem after all, is it? But we could actually write that as a fraction. That's actually 2/5. 2 divided by 5 could be written as 2 divided by 5, which is 2 over 5. Now, negative 10 divided, if I did this problem and I did not watch my order of operations, because some people might look at it and think, geez, I want this to be a little bit, to come out nice. So they may think, let's divide negative 5 by 5 first, which would give us negative 1. Negative 10 divided by negative 1 would give us 10. So notice how you get a completely different answer. Whereas when I multiply it, I get the same answer regardless of what order I multiplied in. So with multiplication, it doesn't matter what order you multiply in as long as you have all multiplication. With division, you always have to work left to right. And if you have different operations in there, then you need to follow your order of operations.